Well, I think there's a segue from the Xinjiang issue to the more sort of political relationship between the EU and China, because I think that has changed since we last spoke. And it kind of characteristically exploded over Xinjiang because the EU, together with the US and the UK, put sanctions on some Chinese officials. China retaliated against European elected officials, against the think tank Merix in Berlin. And as a result, now the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China closed last year under the pressure, enthusiasm of principally Germany, now seems to be in peril in the European Parliament. And there are many more examples of European politicians, at least, taking a much more skeptical view of China. So, as a European firm operating in China and having to deal with both these short and these long-term strategies, how do you look at the political situation in Europe, and does that change your calculus?
So I think that there are so many different threads in there that European companies probably are worrying about. So it is true. At the end of 2020, we had this sudden flurry of diplomatic activity, as you say, really brokered by Angela Merkel with some support from President Macron in France, to pass this comprehensive investment agreement, which is not actually that important a trade deal. It's mostly a market access deal. It mostly favors a few German car companies, a few insurance companies, and most of the reason that China was willing to sign off on that deal after dragging its feet for a very, very long time was related with the fact that this was December. They knew that Joe Biden had won the American election. He was not yet president, and they knew that some people in the Biden administration, the future Biden administration, wanted Europe to wait and tackle China together in a kind of an alliance of democracies to try and force China to change some of its kind of ways. And you even saw the future National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, tweeting in public that Europe should wait. Don't sign this deal just yet. Wait for us to take office. And so that gave China a gigantic political incentive to sign the deal quickly, to prove that it could divide the West, to prove that it could appeal to the European desire for strategic autonomy, and that Europe could be divided effectively from the United States when its economic interests were in play. Now, you're right that since then, after Europe imposed some fairly narrow sanctions on some Chinese officials accused of abuses in Xinjiang, China retaliated with much, much broader, very, very sweeping sanctions, including against members of the European Parliament from 5 of the 6 main political groups in the European Parliament. And on the face of it, that looks a very odd thing for China to do, or at least a very clumsy thing for China to do, because the European Parliament has to endorse the comprehensive agreement with China. And so if you can't get the CAI approved by the European Parliament, it isn't going to become European law. And it's quite clear that at the moment, the European Parliament, when 5 of their 6 main parties are under sanction, are not in the mood to even hold hearings. So you hear people saying, well, why has China not realized the damage it's doing to itself? There's 2 answers to that, I think. One is that China was genuinely shocked by the Xinjiang sanctions. They noticed how serious they were too late. There was a flurry of pressure from the Chinese Foreign Ministry to allies, the people they see as allies in the European Union, above all Hungary, somewhat Greece, some other countries that are seen as kind of willing to block things on China's behalf. And they said to them, can't you block this? How can you let these go through? The problem was that they had misunderstood how Europe works. Actually, the deal had basically been done. It was too late to stop it. The sanctions were imposed. China then lashed out and imposed these sanctions. I am told by senior diplomats here in Beijing that when China imposed those very, very aggressive sanctions on Europe, it believed that Europe would unwind its Xinjiang sanctions within a matter of weeks, because Europe understood that its only hope of economic recovery after COVID lay in further, deeper commercial relations with China. The fact that China has made that politically impossible for now does look like a Chinese mistake. But if you're really cynical, and it's hard not to become really quite cynical here in Beijing, you worry that maybe the win for China was to show that Europe and America can be divided. And they got their win in December last year. And actually, there's not much in the comprehensive agreement on investment for Chinese companies, because Europe's already really open. So, European market opening is not a big ambition for the Chinese. They already have lots of market access. So maybe if this deal never happens, or doesn't happen for many, many years, China doesn't care that much, because it got its win on the day that it showed that it could divide the West and prevent an alliance between Joe Biden and the Europeans taking shape.
And as a European company, how do you look at this greater resistance within, broadly, the European political spectrum? I mean, I think it was earlier this week that the Liberal Party in Germany, the FDP, scrapped the One China policy, basically the reddest of red lines about Taiwan, from its campaign platform. You here in the Netherlands, 3 out of 4 coalition parties actually supported the motion to label what's happening in Xinjiang genocide. The only reason why the executive, the government itself, didn't follow through on that is because the biggest governing party was against that particular motion. So given this political resistance, how as a European country in long-term strategic planning do you take that into account?
I think you need to be worrying about 2 different things. One is decisions that you can make as a company. So clearly, if a Chinese investor comes and wants to buy one of your technologies, or comes to want to buy your company, the politics of that kind of decision have changed really dramatically in the last few years. The kind of deals that saw, Volvo bought by Geely, the Chinese car company, I'm not sure how politically easy those would be now. Or big biotech companies being bought up by Chinese investors, even kind of, partnerships with Chinese partners to develop sensitive technologies and things like biotech. I'm not sure that those are politically an easy sell now. And certainly as a European company, you'll realize that the range of sectors that can be exposed to unpredictable political risks is growing. So you have to factor that in to all of your future investment decisions, because you can be a food exporter selling herrings to China, and you can think I am not going to be exposed to political risk, and then suddenly China says, actually, we found COVID traces on your herring jars, and so we're going to have nationalist publications in China accuse you of bringing in COVID to China on your herring. Now, it hasn't yet happened, I don't think, to Dutch herring makers, but it has happened to Iceland and Norwegian salmon producers. There was a while here in Beijing last year you couldn't buy salmon because the state media was pumping out the idea that salmon was a vector for bringing COVID into China, for which there is no scientific evidence. So turns out that salmon is a sector with political risk. Who knew? So those decisions for companies are becoming more complicated. I think the other thing that is going to really affect the way that companies look at their relationship with China is related to what you were saying about parties in European governments and in parliaments being more willing to take very, very provocative lines on China that are inevitably going to produce a response in China. That is because those parties are responding to public opinion. They can see the same opinion polls that European public opinion is much more skeptical of China, much more wary of China's rise, perhaps willing to blame China for the cover-up at the beginning of COVID, perhaps wondering if, therefore, China is to blame in some way for the entire pandemic that is doing such damage to our economies and to our societies. In that context, European politicians are obliged to take a tougher line on China because it is electorally rewarding to do so and electorally dangerous to be too pro-China. And I think the Chinese government, because they don't really respect democratic mandates, because democracy isn't a system that they think gives you any special kind of claim to legitimacy, they are too quick to be kind of dismissive of public opinion. China basically thinks that because they are this unrivaled market where all the growth is, that politicians will say kind of dramatic things and march up and down and say they're going to be tough on China. And then in China's long experience, those same government ministers or sort of heads of government come to Beijing and behind closed doors with Chinese leaders say, I have to say that stuff, but actually let's, sell you some aeroplanes or some cheese or, whatever it is. There's an angle in that really affects Western companies too, because the other part of those Western government ministers and government leaders coming to Beijing and behind closed doors saying, don't pay too much attention to what I just said about human rights or the Dalai Lama, because actually we want to sell you an Airbus. Western companies got very used to being extremely influential players, at least behind closed doors, when it came to discussions about China. They knew that politicians would come into office talking tough about China, and then if you were the CEO of a big Western company that had lots and lots of workers and pays lots and lots of tax, you could get a meeting with your head of government or your minister and say, can you, calm down, make sure that you look after our interests because we're on the brink of, selling China this or that. You need to really cool it. And those voices were extraordinarily influential for a very long time. And I think so if you're a Western company, you're not just worrying about the decisions that you can make. I think you should also be worrying about the dramatic decline in your ability to lobby your own home government to go soft on China behind closed doors because your business interests are at stake. And I think that is one of the messages that we're seeing government leaders delivering now increasingly in public to businesses, that business interests remain fantastically important. Every Western government is desperate to find a path out of COVID-induced recessions or slumps, and China is going to be part of that. But the days when a Western company could basically buttonhole their prime minister or their president in private to break China promises made on the election trail, that power is much less potent than it was.